Hey, wait, before you grab that lettuce from the grocery store produce section or that pound and a half of shrimp from the seafood section, do you know where it's from or what it really took to get it to your grocery store? Hello and welcome to the Knife and Fork Show. I'm Jason Huffman, the editor-in-chief of Food Chemical News. There's a good chance that food you just picked up traveled thousands of miles to reach you. Did you know that as much as 20 to 25% of the food we consume in the United States today is imported from other countries? And the percentages are much higher if we're talking about produce or seafood. It's big money. During the first 4 months of 2012, more than $35 billion was spent in the United States to buy imported foods. And that amount of imported food we consume keeps climbing every year. But how easy is it really for importers to get their products in the United States? I know just who to ask. The guy sitting right here next to me. Our guest today is Ben Engeln, the president of FDAimports.com. Ben spent 17 years working at the FDA before starting his own consulting business, where he's helped hundreds of companies from all over the world get their food products into this country. Ben, let me ask you first, how cool is it to help companies in other countries get their food into the United States?
Now, my experience is that most importers, particularly food importers, are small businesses. They're very often, when I'm talking to someone who's having a problem with FDA or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I'm usually talking to the owner of the company. And he might have one or two people working for him to help him bring cargo in. But often in these small companies, container by container, they're sort of making their living. So if they can't get one through, then it can do serious damage to them financially. And so as an attorney, my feeling is, my job is to help people, and it's one of those great opportunities to be able to come in and help somebody with a problem that they can't solve, but it means a lot to them. So I find it to be very rewarding.
A lot of times when you talk about food imports, people focus on the percentage of food that the FDA inspects at the ports. But it can't be that easy to get food into the U.S. What are some of the more troublesome barriers or unexpected barriers that food companies run into when they try to get their food into the U.S.?
Yeah, most importers are not really conscious of all of the requirements that the various federal agencies and even some of the state agencies might have for bringing product in. So some of it is just not knowing the requirements. And it's not that the food is unsafe, it's just that they may not be able to prove it up with documentation. So it's not uncommon that I find that importers have good product that they can't always prove it to be good when the FDA starts looking around at their shipments. Another thing is, importers don't realize that the idea of getting it from overseas into the port seems like where they've spent most of their time in preparing for a shipment, and the idea of spending the money and getting a letter of credit. They get the product in the United States only to find that they have to hold it at the port for a period of time until FDA or customs or somebody clears it. And it could take days sometimes, it could take weeks sometimes. And they either it's not built into the supply chain, their buyer is expecting it last week, or they don't have a place to put it. They don't even have a warehouse to place it in the particular port where it shows up. Those are two probably big common problems.
Now, you've worked with a lot of importers over the years. I'm sure you've seen some real dunderhead moves. What are some of the wrong-headed assumptions that importers have about bringing food into the U.S.? What don't they realize, or what do they make mistakes on?
Yeah, I think that one very common area has to do with food colors, right? The colors that are in food. There are many different ways that you can color a food. Some of them are by using FDA-approved colors, others by using sort of natural colors. Things like carrot juice, for instance, can give you a certain color for a food. But there's also these colors that are approved by FDA, and FDA is very specific as to what colors you're allowed to put into certain kinds of food. So that's one area. Another one is the fact that they need to be worried about if it's produce. They have to worry about how their farmers, their suppliers, what kind of pesticides they put on the product. So there's all these things that they may not be sort of thinking about at the time when they're importing it, and they really should have thought about it long before when they were buying it, right? When they were deciding what the contract would be for and what the conditions of the contract would be for.
I'm glad you brought up pesticides, because we just did an article, I talked to you on the phone about this earlier, about pesticides and looking at import alerts and how many types of produce were being stopped over the first 6 months of the year due to pesticides, either illegal pesticides or exceeding certain tolerance levels. And you said that, I think you told me that there is a good explanation for that. And it's not necessarily that these guys are reckless with the pesticides. What's happening with pesticides?
Yeah, it depends upon the pesticide, but there's different kinds of categories of pesticides for produce. There's one category which it's just not permitted in certain foods at all, right? It might be permitted in a group of foods, but not in another group of foods. And so FDA may test it and find it in the category of food where it's not permitted, right? That's a pesticide for which there's no tolerance. But then there's also pesticides where it is permitted in a group of foods, but it's not allowed to be above a certain level, right? And so in the case of the really sort of more popular recent situation had to do with the orange juice and the presence of carbendazim. Right, carbendazim.
Am I saying that right?
I'm not sure how you say it. I actually call it MBC, which is the abbreviation for the chemical name, because it's easier to say too. So MBC, it turns out, is what's called a degradation chemical. It's a chemical that can be added as a pesticide, or another pesticide can be added to the food that is allowed, and after a period of time, that pesticide might degrade down to MBC. And so, in the case of MBC, you see a lot of this testing going on for FDA after they had this first problem.
Right.
And so, a bunch of companies were put on import alert, and so FDA started stopping their product. Well, then you don't see it so much anymore, right? And there's two things going on, I think. One, some of the MBC they're testing for wasn't added as MBC, and it was added as this other pesticide that's permitted. And FDA just assumes that you added MBC.
And how you described it as degrading down to?
Yeah, it's a chemical degradation. It's a natural degradation of one pesticide that's permitted.
It became that chemical.
Pardon me?
And it became that chemical.
Right. It starts off as we call it TPM. It's thiophenate methyl, and that naturally degrades down into MBC. So TPM might be permissible, and it degrades to MBC, which is permissible. But if you were to add MBC to the same food, it would not be permissible, which is sort of weird, right? Because you end up with you have MBC there no matter what. Who cares how it got there?
Yeah, it was really interesting because initially when we were covering this back in, I think it was January, the carbendazim was an orange juice and coming from Brazil.
Right.
But looking at it 6 months later, it's all kinds of produce coming from all kinds of countries,
right.
And not just orange juice. And orange juice ends up being a smaller, group of the products that were coming in.
Yeah, and there are a couple things happen. I mean, one is that once FDA's found MBC and orange juice, they started testing domestically, and what did they find? MBC. And the other thing that I'm always sort of fascinated by with the FDA after being there many years, I probably shouldn't be, but there's a big problem with MBC, and they go test and find it all, and then they're talking about how they've solved the problem because they put a bunch of companies on import alert, and then they go off and do the next thing that's in the news. Right. Well, what's happening now with MBC? I mean, did it suddenly not become a problem? Well, the FDA sort of shifted its risk focus now to something else, and it may or may not be actually evaluating anymore whether MBC is even on produce.
Right. What's the cost of an import not getting into the country? How much what does that mean to the company?
Yeah. I mean, first it's delay. You're not providing your product to your customer, and you can lose the contract. All right, so that can mean your business, right? It also could be that you have to pay for a storage space you weren't expecting to pay for. So that's money. It may have to test it. Pay for a third-party laboratory to come in and take samples and send it to the lab and test it. FDA may sample it, and now you're waiting for them. Or FDA may find a problem with labels. It's amazing how many problems FDA finds just with labeling. And it's the kind of problem that FDA doesn't have to test for, and it's right in front of them. It's right on the label.
Right.
So they always look for labeling violations because it's so easy for them to catch. And once it gets detained and FDA stops the cargo, it can be weeks and weeks before you get it released. And if it gets refused, it has to be destroyed or exported.
And labeling requirements are different in different countries. The U.S. has its own standards, so they may be good in another country, but they come to the U.S. and they're not familiar with what we call things.
That's right. And that's what we do. We spend a lot of time. One of the first things we do with companies is help them think about how they want the product to be presented in the market. That's their marketing, but do it in a way that's not going to run afoul of FDA's labeling requirements.
We're almost out of time, but I want to ask you one more question. What's the worst disaster you've ever seen for an importer trying to get their product into the U.S.?
In my experience, it probably has to do with fresh produce coming out of Mexico across the southwest border. I don't know what the temperature is today down there, but I bet you it's 105 to 113 degrees, right? And so they're bringing in fresh produce. I have companies that bring in cored lettuce, and this is lettuce that has about a 7-day shelf life, assuming it doesn't sit on a dock waiting for USDA to inspect it for about 6 hours, right? The lettuce just wilts, right? And they're waiting for the FDA or the USDA to do its job. That lettuce was perfectly fine when it came out. It had no bugs in it. It was not contaminated with pesticides. They have all the records to prove it, but the government stopped it. And the container goes to the dump. And it's 40-foot load, a 40-foot full container of lettuce. So that kind of thing, I hate to say it's the worst, because it happens actually a lot. Where you have that sort of interference with the government in a supply chain that's actually quite resilient and quite robust.
Okay. Well, I've got to stop you there, Ben, because we are getting the signal that we are out of time. However, while that may be all the time we have for this episode, we're not yet done with Ben England. We'll be back soon to talk to this top food import-export about one of my favorite subjects, food coming from China. He knows the topic well. If you ever have trouble finding the Knife and Fork Show, just go to www.foodchemicalnews.com, where we make these videos available. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.